Welcome to the Week in IndyCar on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires and supported by our friends PNC Bank. I'm so pleased to have our friend Mr. Leigh Diffey back. It hasn't been that long since we had you on for the most recent episode, Leigh. I figure coming out of a complex weekend like Pocono, where you were fortunately in the broadcast booth, and as I told you, did an exceptional job of managing a very tough day. I figured you were the perfect person to be my co-pilot here to walk through some tough and or mildly aggro situations with class.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. It's firstly, it's a pleasure to be back on, and thanks. And you know what a fan I am of your podcast. You know, in replacement of and in lieu of Dave Despain's wind tunnel and things like that, I think there's a gaping hole in the motorsports market that needs an update, an all-rounded update, and your podcast certainly is fulfilling that gap. So I'm very pleased to be back on, and I wish we had some nicer things to talk about other than the Robert Wickens situation at Pocono at the weekend. That's for sure. But and I know that I echo you and everybody involved, not only in IndyCar but in the motorsport world, that everybody is thinking about Robert.
It's been so heartening, mate, to have received. I've lost track, and I can tell you that you have lost track. Robin Miller's lost track. So many people who are accustomed to communicating with folks who follow this sport. We've all been inundated, and I say that in the best possible way, with people in the sport, outside of the sport, in different forms of the sport. How is he? What's going on? What do you know? And it isn't, the vast majority hasn't been folks probing for gory details. It's been quite the opposite. Concerned legends and heroes. Robin Miller was telling me, I mean, truly IndyCar's Mount Rushmore, from Parnelli Jones to Johnny Rutherford to Bobby Unser and AJ Foyt, and you name it, all asking, how is the boy? How's he doing? What do you think? And it's just purely out of care. And I think that, Leigh, is probably one of the more remarkable things, knowing that at least over here, he's not even done with his first year of racing. It's not like this is a, quote, old friend that folks are checking in on. He's clearly made a big impact on people as a rookie.
It speaks to, I mean, I could go so many different directions here with this, because on the broadcast of the weekend, when we had, you know, just about a 2-hour fill when the red flag, under the red flag circumstances, you know, multiple times I did my best to articulate to our viewers, you know, the motorsport world seems like such a big world, so many different categories, etc. But it really isn't. It's quite a tight-knit family. Well, then you kind of rinse it down to the IndyCar community, which is an incredibly tight-knit community, and so it speaks to that closeness. But for those legends of the sport to be so concerned, it's beautiful from a human nature standpoint, but I can tell you their concern is elevated because of their respect for him as such a racer, which he has shown us this year, you know, time and again, and which is really, really special, really, really special. And yep, I mean, unfortunately, in your career and in my career, we have dealt with injuries and you know, bad injuries and bad crashes time and again. Somebody was asking me about it the other day, and you know, I started listing the amount of unfortunate incidents that I've had to commentate on, and then do those, what we call in the industry, fill or pad times. And sometimes it can be half an hour, sometimes it can be an hour, and then like the other day, sometimes it can be 2 hours, and you know, that's, you know, I mean, you can use so many different metaphors. Whatever, you're on your toes, you're tap dancing, you're skipping, you're doing everything you can to keep the viewers informed the best you can. All while in the back of your mind, you're thinking about a guy that you just saw a few minutes ago. Do you know one of the lasting memories I have about that weekend was after the driver introductions, and Robert was interviewed in our pre-race show. He got off the back of those Hummers. You know, the Hummers were taking the drivers around for the driver parade and driver introductions. he got off the Hummer, and it just happened to be a segment where I was on my own, and Townsend and Paul weren't involved in that segment. Paul was about 6 feet from me, giving him a handshake and a hug and wishing him well and talking about what the race, what was coming up in the race. And that will be something that will never leave my mind. And just to think about where he is now it's crushing.
So before we get too far into things, I'll mention that the standard format for our Week in IndyCar show and also our Week in Sports Cars show has been one of insight and analysis and some news and whatnot for the first half, then getting into questions for the second half. On the Week in Sports Cars side, Lee, we have recently shifted to a format where instead of the gab fest up front and the questions later, I've actually been using the questions to drive the conversation from the outset. And I think we're going to do that here. Well, I know that we're going to do that here. I've just made the executive decision, but I think we're going to start doing that here as well. And we have almost twice as many questions for this week's episode than we've ever had.
Oh, wow.
And as I mentioned before we started recording, I know it's not because of me, and I know it's not because of you. I think it's because there's so much to talk about from Pocono and so much concern being expressed, both concerns for Robert and concerns for other practices and policies. So let's get into that right away. What we normally do, though, one thing we're certainly carrying over before we get into Q&A, we look back to my favorite question from the previous week, and courtesy of our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com, I pick my favorite question, and we send that person a Week in IndyCar, I almost said sports car, a Week in IndyCar t-shirt of their whatever preferred size they might have. And in doing that, last week when we had Colton Herta on as our guest, Daniel Ferris asked my favorite. He said, Colton, you and your dad are racing in the Indy 500 on the last lap. You are second. He is first. How aggressive are you? And do you go for the win? And would you bump him for the win coming off of turn 4? To which Colton did not hesitate and said, "Oh yeah." And that was a lot of fun getting into the fact that old man Herta, yeah, you don't want to be in front of your son, final corner of the Indy 500, because you're getting dumped, pal. So, Daniel, send me a little DM here. Let me know what size t-shirt you want and your address. We'll get you all sorted again, courtesy of our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com, and I know that they also have, I believe, Lee, 1 or 2 possible get well soon kind of honorarium stickers for Robert that I'm sure every car will have. Maybe you can stick one on top of PT's shiny head too. That would be kind of fun for the broadcast.
Oh, that would be fun.
PNC is proud to sponsor Scott Dixon, driver of the number 9 car for Chip Ganassi Racing. Everyone tunes in on race day, but so much of the race is determined off camera during the work put in throughout the week, month, and year. From the gym to the practice track, Scott Dixon and the team take small steps every day to get closer to victory lane. Copyright 2018, the PNC Financial Services Group Incorporated. All rights reserved. PNC Bank, National Association, member FDIC. With all that said, my friend, let's jump into the Q&A. And I think you might have seen by now I put up a Q&A a little bit earlier. I shouldn't say Q&A, an op-ed piece a little bit earlier today touching on some of the subjects of note from Pocono, and happy to dive into some of those on a deeper capacity. And we'll go to David Steffel. David's a pal who you might have seen walking around the paddock with a Cooper tire, slick tire over his shoulder that has about 1 million autographs, and he's trying to get the last couple. He said, will the series adopt a windshield/halo? And David, to my knowledge, everything is going according to plan with an intent to mount every car with the IndyCar Series Opticore based wind screen. I don't know if they've come up with a name yet, Lee. That's still, is it a windshield? Is it an Aero screen? A wind screen? What is it? But I do know that is, I haven't heard anything to tell me otherwise, that come 2019, every car for every race will be using one to help deflect whatever debris that it can possibly withstand. We saw this past weekend with injuries to Hinch's hands from debris coming through, with the camera atop Ryan Hunter-Reay's roll hoop getting cleared clean off as well. This was yet another confirmation to me that if we had a Aero screen ready now, it sure would have been useful last weekend.
I think so. I think in the James Hinchcliffe situation, I think it may have added some deflection and some help for Hinch. And thank goodness his injuries, in his own words, he very kindly sent us a text message during the broadcast that he said, "I'm fine." He said, I took my hands off the wheel and had my hands up near my helmet, and some debris came in and caught me on the tops of my hands, and they're just bruised and swollen, but I'm fine. And if any of your listeners here on the podcast are wondering why James didn't speak to us on the broadcast, he was literally, and in all fairness to him, it is totally up to him. A, he wasn't in the mood, because B, he was fast-tracking it out of there to get to Lehigh Valley Hospital to see Robert Wickens. So, life throws us curveballs, right? And that was a massive one. And if anyone knows what it's like to be in a life-threatening accident, it's James Hinchcliffe, and so we fully respected that. And he just said, "Guys, I'd love to, but I don't. I'm not. I desperately want to get to the hospital to see Robbie." So that's what happened. That's why we didn't hear from Hinch. But yeah, to your point, that would have assisted in that situation. I don't think it would have done really. I'm not sure what it would have done in the Wickens crash situation for Robert independently, but that's a totally different story. I agree with you 100%. I'm not a fan of the halo in Formula One aesthetically, but I'm a fan of doing something to try and protect the drivers more. You've got the purists out there who say open wheel racing is open wheel racing, and the inherent risks when you engage in that sport. Yep, I get that, I take that, but at the same time, if there's one extra step that can be made to protect the drivers, let's do it. Why not? Let's do it. And so long as the Aero screen, windscreen, windshield, whatever it's going to be called in IndyCar, so long as there's no visibility issues in night races or in wet races, so long as that is taken care of, so long as it doesn't reduce the visibility, I'm all for it.
Next question is one that came in from Roger Dingus. I apologize, Roger. And this is one that we've had this asked many, many ways, so apologize that I won't be calling out everyone by name individually who sent in a question regarding the fences, but we'll roll a lot of the topic into the one offered by Roger. And he says, with the fences still being the biggest safety concern that hasn't been addressed by any racing series, what would you like to see happen? And boy, Lee, a lot of us, probably all of us, have spent the moments since Robert went into the fence, dating back to when we lost our friend Dan Weldon, dating back to, there's so many instances we can think of where drivers have gotten up into the fence in IndyCar. What has been done, what's being done, what is out there that isn't being used, what could be a new solution. And I think this one, Roger, and I think this one, Lee, this pushes us. This pushes us to question ourselves and our resolve for how important we truly consider this to be. If you, I'll just throw out another example. If you were hit by someone who was texting and driving, anti-texting and driving is probably going to become your thing. You might become an advocate. You might join something, donate time, volunteer, give money, something to improve that because you've been directly affected by it. It also wouldn't be a surprise after some amount of time where the big passion to fix this thing and stop it from hurting folks wanes. It's a bit of a normal arc for many people, myself included. Not everyone, but it's not an abnormal situation. Big spike in passion, intent focus, maybe that tapers off and it's no longer your passion point. I'd say this is one of them, Lee, where this isn't the first time, definitely not the last time. We're going to talk about this. What could be done that's better? Is it a different design? Get rid of the poles and cables. Go to ballistic something like the windscreen material. What would that cost to do it? I think this is just going to be another scenario where we in the sport find out, is this something where in the days and weeks after a bad accident like Robert's, we are fired up and passionate about it, and then you don't really read about it a month from now because we've all kind of moved on, or it's no longer become a big passion point? Maybe let's start there.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Absolutely, because I think the tracks, and it's easy for us to say because we're not the ones with our own money on the line in terms of being a track owner or a track promoter, but particularly from the owner's standpoint, where they've invested so many millions of dollars in the facility, in the infrastructure, and these kind of accidents happen not often. They happen randomly and sporadically. When they do, it causes a shocking effect and a very emotional response. But then they say, well, it doesn't happen that often, so why would I spend all this money to redo my fences? Well, I think we need to move beyond that, and I think there are better solutions. I'm not a fencing expert, so perhaps I'm not the person to ask, but certainly the FIA and IndyCar and the FIA and NASCAR are in contact a lot more than we realise. And I learned that fact from Mike Helton. So the FIA have certainly come up with some what I would like to say better ideas for fencing. I was just talking with Jimmy Vasser yesterday afternoon. Jimmy said, hell, what about making the safer barriers higher?
Yep. That's been a popular one to crop up. What about doubling the height, for example?
Doubling the height, and at the same time, you don't want to cheat or disadvantage the fans, the race fans, who are up nice and close to the track and getting a great view with a big high white fence. But maybe it takes 5 or 6 rows of seating out and people move further up the grandstands or whatever it might be so that they can still see the cars and their favourite drivers. But as a group that we all are, that we're all involved and we're all invested in it, surely there has to be something done. I mean, those big posts scare the hell out of me, scare the absolute hell out of me. And when you see, and again, we only think about it, and let's be honest, we only think about it when something like Wickens' crash happens, or something, like Dan Weldon happens, or any time you see Mike Conway at Indianapolis, whenever you see a car get up into the fence, then all of a sudden it's at the forefront of our consciousness. And maybe as a group we all need to be more proactive, and let's do something about that, because we revere and honour and savour and celebrate these amazing drivers that you earn a career out of and I earn a career out of from the entertainment and information standpoint. We've got to protect them. We've got to keep them alive, and certainly compared to the 60s and 70s and even 80s, the driver mortality and driver injury rate is certainly way down. Way down. Safety is so much better these days, but doesn't mean it can't be even better.
So, a couple great things in there that you mentioned. There's been some, again, comments on, well, why not double the height of the safer barrier? And if we needed to move fans further up, or we take away some seating where you can't see the cars as clearly because of that higher obstruction, well, maybe that's just part of the accepted price of adding greater safety. I can't disagree with that. I'm always somewhat loath to try and spend other people's money, Leigh. I do know that, having spoken with IndyCar in the past and some track owners in the past, the cost of safer barrier per foot is not a small and insignificant number.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And, you might say, if it was easily affordable, we'd already see something like this. The counter to that is, well, what is a human life worth? And I don't mean to sound callous, but as you folks might have read, watched, or come across in whatever method, that's something that automotive companies have done in the past. What does it cost to implement this fix to something that we know is a problem versus how much do we think it's going to cost us in possible litigation for any fatalities that may happen? I am not saying by any stretch of the imagination that tracks are sitting there going, what would it cost us to double the rows of safer barrier versus potential fatalities? I'm not saying it's that cold, but I would say that there obviously has been some real brutal assessment of what is this going to cost and how much do we think it is going to help. Hopefully that question is thrown back out for folks to consider. If we're talking about ovals in particular, then there's some other things. And through our friend Robin Miller, I know that he spoke with Randy Bernard back in the day when there was questions following Las Vegas on the ballistic, treating ovals like a hockey rink where you have that ballistic material protecting fans. And the number quoted there, I think for a larger oval, I could be wrong on the exact size, but it was something like, in materials alone, Lee, $45 million. And so we're not talking about posts, we're not talking about labor and installation, we're talking just the material was almost $50 million for a single track.
That's where we get into the whole thing, and even when I was a kid racing motorcycles, right? It's the same argument. Well, boy, your parents are spending a lot of money buying you motorcycles and boots and helmets and gear and all that kind of stuff. Why don't you just play tennis? All you need to buy is a racket and some shoes. It's that whole thing about if you compare the safety element of NHL or NBA or NFL or any other professional sport, well, they're not dealing with the perimeter of a 2.5-mile super speedway. It's we're not talking apples to apples here, and that is again another mitigating factor, right? It's another contributing factor to why this argument could go around in circles, pardon the pun, but could go around in circles forever because it's a monster.
All right, Lee, our next question comes from Thomas Gross. He says, why didn't NBC have a camera angle that showed Robert in the car? He says we didn't see him in the car, get out of the car, enter the ambulance, or to be placed into the helicopter. And I think there's a fairly basic answer there.
I appreciate Thomas's question, and I'm a viewer too. I've got my favourite sports in addition to motorsport, which is my lifelong love and passion. I love golf and I love football and love lots of different sports. And sometimes I ask the same question, but we can't have cameras everywhere. It's impossible. You work to a budget, and that it is what it is. And then also about the basically, I think I'm not sure Thomas is asking this, but almost like a follow cam of every moment of the process. You've got to have some kind of sensitivity in a very serious medical situation. I mean, if you're watching NFL and a player there's concerns for spinal injury or something like that, they don't have cameras following him down the tunnel, etc. I mean, you've got to draw the line somewhere, and it was just because he was up against the inside wall. It was in a very, where his car came to rest. It was in a very bizarre place where we just simply didn't have a camera. It's a 2.5-mile circuit, so like I said, we can't have cameras everywhere. And as far as basically documenting every step of the way, well, I think that would be quite insensitive. So appreciate the question, Thomas, but hopefully that answers your question.
I also think, Lee, that even if NBCSN or any broadcaster did happen to have a camera that was able to point live at what was taking place,
you absolutely wouldn't show it.
It would get cut.
Yeah, totally.
It would get cut until someone from within the series, I would imagine, would convey to someone on the broadcast side, in, again, whatever broadcaster, that this is a situation that we're okay to continue with live footage. That, Lee, is actually not so much the footage part, but the informational, I think, question that is at the heart of what Thomas is saying. I apologize, Thomas. that he's asking, that's actually the number one question we've received from so many folks on Twitter and on Facebook, wanting to know why it took 57 minutes for news, the first news of Robert's condition, to be conveyed to the world. That's something that, as you know, I spent a fair amount of time on the phone yesterday trying to seek out answers to that, and wrote about that in the little opinion piece that I put up today on Racer.com. A very complex and nuanced thing, which I did not know that it was at the time. Where do you think we should start here? And I can, pick out some specific questions from folks if desired, but maybe just in a general sense, let's open on how information is transferred to a booth. And I mention this again, knowing that you have worked in booths throughout the world from, name every multi-letter broadcaster, whether it's NBC, NBCSN, Fox, this, that, you name it. You've been inside many booths, maybe not so much Pocono specifically, but what's the general practice of how information would come into you and how it would be treated or processed in the event of a serious injury or one that you don't have a full picture on what's taking place?
Well, first and foremost, the information comes to us via our producer/producers, and when it's a very delicate and sensitive matter, it's dealt with accordingly. If I can hit the rewind button a little bit, I can tell you about one of the first IndyCar races that I ever called. I did a couple of races when I was still in Australia in the late 1990s for the Surfers Paradise race. But
yeah.
the first kart/IndyCar race that I called overseas, unfortunately, was the race where Alex Donati lost his legs. And I was living in London at the time, working for the BBC, but for 2 weekends I was working for ESPN International to call the Lausitzring race in Germany and then the Rockingham race in the UK. And in that instance, when I was working for ESPN International, they had a coding system, so a 1 to 5 coding system, which I think was not necessarily an ESPN thing. I think it was a kart coding system for television. And we were told then from our producer, who was on the line on the other side of the world in Bristol, Connecticut, and Ben Edwards and I were in Lausitzring, this is a code 5. Do not say anything. Do not say anything, because they didn't know if Alex was going to live. Yeah. And that was brutal to go through. The weekend here was, I'm not going to say the same. It was somewhat different, but I think it's really important for me to say straight up front, I don't work for IndyCar. I'm not inside IndyCar. I don't know what their protocol is or procedural management structure is in crisis situations. I don't know that, and that's really important for me to say that. So,
let me interject here a little bit, Lee, because having spent that fair amount of time on the phone, I think I can explain a few things that may be a little bit deeper, just because I did take the time to try and get some specific answers on the timeline and whatnot. Maybe the overarching thing to address, and I'll piggyback here off of a question Tom Anderson has asked that has been asked by so many people in some form. He asked you, which you've touched on a bit, how difficult is it to commentate during such a moment as the incident in Pocono? And then Tom says, is there information that you may have but keep to yourselves in the booth or otherwise out of respect for those involved? And this is a case where Lee, Paul, Towney, myself, you name it, from broadcast to the media in the media center to the teams on pit lane, did not know about Robert's status, and I mean basic status, alive or not, until that 57-minute mark when the series made the formal announcement over the air. And I know this because during that 57-minute span, I know I was one of many who was being asked by folks on pit lane, hey, We haven't heard anything. Nothing has come across from race control. No updates. Time's running on, getting worried here. What do you know, etc. So even down to the folks on pit lane under red flag conditions, on the timing stands themselves, if there was, just trying to be straight and clear here, there was no wink, nudge, or high sign that folks in the paddock, in the media, or in the booth got and then sat on. This was truly a case where, for 57 minutes, until IndyCar VP of Communication Kurt Cavan walked out and said what he said, everyone outside of that, other than those inside of the medical facility, were truly in the dark. So that it's, again, worth stating that up front. And if there had been news prior to this that he was okay, I'm sure it would have been conveyed at some point. But this also gets into another question, Lee, and it's, this is, as I mentioned, we have more questions on this subject than anything from Pocono, so we'll visit this for a little while and sit here. Eric Harkrader said, both, can you guys talk a little bit about the ethics and rules of reporting in that situation? He said, I've seen several people, including PT, criticize the lack of info and speed at which the information was shared by the series. What is your opinion on the correct way to handle these situations and by journalists? And I'll take that to start, Lee. Going back to what I have come to understand on the 57 minutes part, Eric, and I'll just get into that before we touch on the ethical part. We had Robert in the car for a good 15 minutes, up to maybe 20, after the accident. So this wasn't a case of getting there, pulling him out right away. There was a decent amount of time taken on site at turn 2 with him in the car. We don't know anything other than it took between 15 and 20 minutes to get him out and in an ambulance. Whether anything else, conscious, unconscious, physical state, what was or wasn't hurt, pure conjecture. So we're not going there. We do know 15 to 20-ish before he was ready to head to the infield medical center. From there, understanding process-wise, Lee, with 4 other drivers involved in this 5-car crash, they were seen and processed. Process could be, you're fine, we took a look at you, you said there's no problems, we see there's no problems, off you go, to you're complaining of pain, you have some cuts, whatever it might be, sit down, do a longer exam, then write up that that document those findings as well. Per IndyCar's procedures, there's no, we took a look visually, turned around and said, hey, IndyCar communications team, driver so-and-so is fine, tell the world. There's a required paper trail, documentation of formal findings by Dr. Billows, who is IndyCar's head of medical. And so in this process, if you think about it, and I'm not necessarily vouching for anything, saying I agree, disagree, I'm just stating what I understand the process to be. We had 5, call it orders. We had order number 1, driver who came in, exam, review, document, and pass that off to IndyCar for them to say either to the media in their trackside report document. They also use the Slack app made available to members of the media to try and hit as many internal avenues as possible to tell folks driver Ryan Hunter-Reay was checked and cleared by IndyCar Medical. Great, got it. Who's next on the list? And they'll work through that list. From what I understand, with Robert arriving at the medical center at some point after the 20-minute mark or so, after his crash, with other drivers either still being seen or tended to, and his condition, I believe, not being received as critical emergency, all hands on deck, even if you're another driver and you've got a cut or a bruise or something, we're going to truly just dive in on this emergency. I don't believe, could be wrong, but I don't believe that is how Robert was received in the medical facility. So, again, from what I understand, processes of going through each of the 4 drivers that had come in, the review processes, the documentation process, which closed the loop on each one individually, was happening, along with receiving Robert and then needing to do a medical exam on him. So the last bit to this on the medical side, we do not know the full extent of his injuries, but we do know that from the updates offered by IndyCar that clearly Dr. Billows had some work to do. In terms of an assessment, Ryan Hunter-Reay, who we saw climb out of the car and walk away and was essentially fine, that exam by comparison would have been a quick one. We can safely state Robert, when arriving, would have taken more time. And so I don't know how much time, but I know that I've heard by approximately the 40 to 45 minute mark after the crash, Robert's processing and examination had been completed. That leaves somewhere in 12 to 17 minutes until the news was made available for the first time. The next and final processes overall, Lee, that I understand, was the documentation of the doctor's findings, and then the reporting of that to IndyCar's senior management, the team, Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports, and Robert's family. The last step would be after that reporting of this is what we found in an initial exam, is what do you want, what don't you want said in a formal statement, and then actually physically writing that, whether it's on a notepad, I can't say, but I believe from IndyCar side, from the team side, and the family side, all 3 weigh in on what they do or don't want, agree upon what would be said, and at that point, in that 12 to 17 minute process of alerting the 3 parties, asking what they want, what they did or didn't want conveyed, we got to the point at 57 minutes where Kurt Cavan walked out and said what he said, letting us know that Robert was awake and alert. Now, that is also the point where you and I and many others learned for the first time that this was not going to be an extremely grave day from there on out. Where there are questions, Lee, and Eric will get to the topic of ethics in just a moment and rules, but where this points forward, Lee, is that's a very detailed process. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just don't know if there's wiggle room built in a severe situation like this, or one that at least has been received as a severe situation. Big crash, no cameras for anyone to discern on their own whether the driver is okay, and then essentially a long period of replays and an information blackout or void. We live in a time, man, where when that happens, worst fears start to creep in. I don't know what percentage of people, but enough to have heard from many of them saying, man, I was sweating bullets until we found out, and boy, it felt like it took too long. I'm curious, we'll be curious to see if IndyCar comes to the conclusion that I offered as an external comment, that we don't want someone on the AMR safety team or anyone else getting on the radio saying, hey Lee, hey Marshall, hey whomever, he's fine or he's not fine. We would want a doctor to take a proper assessment. Not only is the person physically alive, are they stable? And so I'm not saying that anything should be done in a shortcut manner, but if we do have a scenario like this, I would think someone in the series communication side would realize that if there's a earlier point, we could let the world know that this person is okay, provided they are okay. Maybe we don't need to let the theater of the mind and worst fears run rampant. So I know it's a bit of a long explanation, but I think there's some sensitivity there that might have been missed.
Yeah, I hear your point wholeheartedly, and if I can use an example that I lived through in a different sport just last year. And just parking that for a moment, would I have, as the guy hosting the show and the guy having to come up with continual questions and working with our producer Terry Lingner and Rich O'Connor and everybody to try and be creative and be professional and be sensitive and be all of those things at once and deliver the message? I mean, it's like I said before, it's tough. Like that's really when we earn our money. And but would I have liked the news sooner? Absolutely. But with that being said, and getting to the question of ethics and procedure, etc., what I want is I want the news, but I want it to be correct. And I have been in the situation where the news was delivered and it wasn't correct, and it was in a different sport. It was in rugby, and I was calling a national championship game. And in the first 5 minutes of the game, there was a rolling maul, and a player went down, and the maul collapsed. Players got up except for one kid. And next minute, there's a stretcher on the field. His mother and father are on the field in tears. This poor young athlete gets ambulanced away, and there were some very grave concerns. He was in a neck brace, etc. And we were delivered the wrong information too soon, saying that things look a lot brighter. He has feeling in his toes, feet, legs, and arms, and he's gone to hospital just for further evaluation. In the end, it turned out the kid was paralyzed from the chest down. And we lived that moment live, and then we had to deal with it after the fact, that we'd delivered, not through our own fault, but through, the wrong message being given to us, which was just terrible to live with after the fact. Now, this young man has made miraculous advancements, and he took his first steps at the end of last year. And
amen.
There is some positivity on that, but and I'm only saying this because you asked me the question. I'm just telling you what it's like from where I sit. And when you are the deliverer and the conduit of incorrect information, when you're talking about somebody's health and welfare and it's incorrect, that is just horrible. It haunts you. And so, I repeat, would I have liked information sooner for selfish reasons, for myself and for my colleagues and for the audience? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, you want the information that is correct and that is right and appropriate. And I tell you, mate, this is a difficult situation. This is a difficult scenario, and it's a difficult topic to talk about.
So I'll bounce around a little bit on a couple of topics here, Eric, that get back to the heart of your inquiry. PT was wrong. He should not have tweeted out what he did. I've spoken with him more than once since Sunday. Well, spoke to him on Sunday, I believe, but spoken with him multiple times since then. He has since learned what he did was wrong. I take his word for this. I've known Paul for a good while, and I know you have as well, Lee, and others have. There are many things that Paul might be that some folks do not find savory, if not outright despise. It's fine. I'm not saying everything about Paul, his political beliefs and otherwise, they're massively at odds with my own and or just views on life. That isn't what we're talking about here. We're talking about a guy who I've known to be brutally honest, at times to his detriment, and what he told me was he didn't even think about it. I don't know if he knew that this was something to weigh and consider. Now, pleading ignorance is the easy out, right? Oh, I didn't know any better. Hey, sorry, oops, won't do it again. It could be taken as that, Paul just looking for an excuse. At least in the conversation we had, I did not receive that kind of dismissal, like, oh, hey, I can just say I made a mistake. I don't think he knew, and Paul is in an interesting place professionally where you, Lee, you are a professional broadcaster. You might not be a professional journalist, as in sitting there writing stories all day, it doesn't matter. There's no higher or lower grade. What I do mostly with a keyboard, on far less occasion in the broadcast world, you and I both know our friend David Malsher, Jim Aiello, this person, that person, name so many others, Kevin Lee and Katie Hargan, I mean, Jan Beekes. There are many that know either the rules of journalism, the ethics. Tony DeZino's another one. Know the rules, know what to do, what not to do, what is considered fair play. There's no union, just for the sake of clarity. It's not like we all, show up each month at the Journalism 101 meeting and whatnot. It's an informal thing, but PT falls into an interesting place as a former driver turned color analyst. PT has not gone to journalism school. We aren't even sure if he's gone to high school, if he's taken English classes. We're just happy he no longer drools on himself. So there's some levels of lowered expectation here. But all kidding aside, PT fits into a bit of a gray area. That's something that this exchange has revealed. And I don't think he truly knew that when he was tweeting out what he tweeted, that he was breaking a code in a profession that, again, I would not look at Paul and think of him as a Leigh Diffey type broadcaster or whomever type journalist, because it's kind of a plug and play thing. Come in, do what he does, and does it with excellence, and then unplug. So I know for a fact
that's why he's there. That's why he's there.
And I know
for that very reason.
I know for a fact, and you know for a fact, he has since learned and been informed that such things will not be acceptable in the future. So this has been very much a learning point for him. Other thing I'll add here, Lee, and I know this to be true with many of us. I would say at least a dozen of us that I know. There are the things that have been reported by IndyCar since Sunday about Robert's medical conditions. I would say that everything I have seen come out has fit what I have known to expect based on input received from outside of IndyCar. You, me, and again, I don't want to just keep repeating the same names, Robin and this, right? We hear a lot of things, and whether it's about a driver in an accident or who's leaving what team to go to that team, remind me to talk about Felix Rosenquist in a little bit, by the way. We hear a lot of stuff, and some of these things are, we filter out. Then there are things like Robert's accident, where there are a lot of things on the topic of things you might have known in the booth but chose not to say or otherwise. Even if you had known beforehand, I know that you would not have gotten ahead and would have waited for IndyCar to inform the world before saying anything. And in this instance as well, Eric, there, I would say, quite a few people who are fairly confident that they know a number of things about Robert's condition. And while I do not do a daily accounting to see which reporter has written what or speculated what, I believe for the most part everyone has fallen in line, kept the things that may or may not prove to be true that they could have used to win their I broke the news first Pulitzer Prize. I've seen for the most part, I believe almost 100%ly, that for those who do have a pretty good feeling as for what is or isn't going on, they are doing what they should.
It really, in my opinion, it falls under the umbrella of, in this situation or in situations like this, there's no trophies for being first. Just be right, be correct. And, you were the guy who worked for weeks, if not months, on the Alonso to the Indy 500 story 18 months ago, last before last year's Indy 500, and unfortunately, certain entities broke embargoes, and you didn't get to break that story. But that was your story. I know that for a fact, and so there's no prize unless it's a situation like that. There's no prizes for being first. Just be right, be correct. And just for your listeners' question, I think it was Eric. I want to circle back and go back to the PT thing. And I'm not condoning what he did, or I'm not defending him. I'm just giving some more insight into the person that Paul Tracy is. And he was this hard-ass racer and a tough guy, and now, he's no longer he was always a big guy when he raced, but he's no longer that. He went through that quite thin phase, and he's no longer like that. He hits the weights pretty hard, right? And he's a big guy. He's a big dude now, and he comes across as this big, tough, tattooed guy who's brash and whatever. But I want to tell you, listeners, that he is actually a human being. He's a father, and he is incredibly sensitive and caring. And I don't think he probably got about an hour's sleep on Sunday night. He was mentally exhausted. When we all left the booth, and I only live about 2.5 hours, if that, from Pocono. I didn't even go home. I stayed in the hotel that night. He asked Townsend to drive to the airport because he was mentally zapped. It was an emotionally draining day, and I think, and as I told you earlier in the podcast, that he had that embrace with Wickens right before the race started.
Well, he's known him and looked at him like, if not a little brother, looked at him and Hinch as his successors, the next generation. Absolutely. Since Robbie was single digit age, since he was a true kid. And so, again, that's not excusing anything. It just might lend some further understanding that for PT, this is a case of someone he's known forever, has a deep passion for, roots for. I mean, he loves the kid. And I think with him being able to say, look, here's what I've heard. It's not grave. Again, I'm making an assumption, but I think the intent came from a good place. He just has learned it was a wrong place after the fact.
100%. And that's why I said what I said, because I think Paul is quite often misunderstood. Does he shoot from the hip? Absolutely he does. Sometimes does he shoot from the hip too fast? Absolutely.
Into his feet. Yes.
Yeah, but there's no he's not a malicious person. He's not a vindictive person. He just he likes to get the facts out there. Of course, he shares his opinion, and he has some pretty strong opinions sometimes. But
no,
I wanted to get that out there from where I sit, from the person who I've seen and learned. And you got to remember too that I've known him now in two ways. As a person in the media who had to go and interview him, and then I got to become friends with him through mutual friends in racing, and then now he's my colleague. And I've taken a great deal of pride in helping him become a better broadcaster, and which he is. And some of his insight is fantastic. And to have him and Tony Kanaan, who have been old friends, in the booth together at the same time, and Townsend never reached the heights that he wanted to in IndyCar, but he has in sports cars, winning Le Mans, doing 3 Le Mans, finishing on the podium all 3 times, etc. So Townsend never reached the heights that he wanted to in IndyCar, but to have those 3 guys in the booth, Townsend is an amazing broadcaster. He's a different broadcaster to Paul, and we can't even call TK a broadcaster, but TK did an amazing job. It kind of blew his mind the other day how fast everything happened in there. But he really enjoyed it. He had a lot of fun, and he was incredibly insightful. And to have both. And as we were sitting in the line of order, it was me on the left, Townsend, then Paul, then TK, and so you had the old mates together on the end there. And considering the length of the duration of that 500-mile race, not counting the 2-hour stoppage, it was good to have Tony come up and have some fun and have a laugh. And because who knows? We don't know how much longer Tony's going to drive for, right? So to have a legend
30
like
years, at least 30 years.
Another 10 years. But, that was good to have him up there. I guess we're wandering here. We're wandering away from Eric's question, but hopefully all of this information is helpful, Eric.
Look, it's just this podcast is hopefully never much more than just a conversation among friends. Townie, I'll tell you, and I've said this to him, and I've said this before in the podcast, he is so good at what he does in the booth, I fear he's going to become a Jan Beekes type broadcaster in the years to come, meaning folks aren't really going to know that he was ever a race car driver unless he brings it up, because he's such a natural at what he does. He doesn't feel like the ex-athlete color commentator that we see in any sport. You know when there's someone talking, you're like, okay, this guy's not really a pro. Ex-athlete brings in that color side, that's great. Townie is so dang good at what he does that, I think folks, new fans in the coming years might not know that he isn't just a TV guy. TK, man, I realize he went out early in the ABC Supply 500, came up in the booth to help continue and extend the value to ABC Supply, the sponsor of his car, but as I tweeted, he has a career waiting for him in the booth whenever he wants, because he was fantastic. To be honest, I'm just saying, you were the weak link, Diffey. I mean, I'm kind of surprised you didn't step out. But anyways, we'll give you another shot. Every
booth always needs a TV idiot. Every booth needs always the TV guy.
Well, let's take a little break here and hear a message from our friends at PNC is proud to sponsor Scott Dixon, driver of the number 9 car for Chip Ganassi Racing. Scott knows that the road to victory lane starts today. Copyright 2018, the PNC Financial Services Group Incorporated. All rights reserved. PNC Bank, National Association, member FDIC. All right, Lee, so I know that we have 10 or 15 more minutes with you. You're actually in the Bay Area. If traffic wasn't so horrendous here, we could have met up and done this directly, but it's actually smarter to call from Fremont to San Francisco. This next question from Gary Petrie. Thanks for this one, Gary. This is actually not only a great question, but one that I had a friend of ours answer for us. He says, hey, Marshall, Wickens' accident brought to mind interviews with Mamo Gidley and others about how they were looked after by either the series or similar after they had a big crash, and he was wondering if IndyCar does something similar for their drivers. So, Gary, there's couple of answers in offer here, and I reached out to my friend, the friend of many in IndyCar, sports car, you name it, in terms of those paddocks, and that is John Gorsline, who offers direct insurance for drivers. In many cases, Lee, as you well know, race car drivers are not direct employees of the teams they drive for. They are subcontractors, or put even more simply, small business men and women who are their own product that they offer and sell, meaning that they do not necessarily, when they are driving for Team X, they're not necessarily on that team's healthcare plan and insurance plan and life insurance. And so while they are in some cases, we have someone like our pal John Gorsline, who is always around and always seemingly looking after folks. And he said here, in response to your question, he said the IndyCar Series provides medical coverage if the driver does not have personal coverage. He said a small amount of disability coverage and death insurance is also provided. He said some teams do require drivers to obtain their own coverage for medical and disability. And he said we find most established drivers do carry their own, and he closes with saying newer drivers a lot of times do not have their own, so the IndyCar coverage would prevail. And I know, for example, Lee, that when the big man, Justin Wilson, we're just a day or two away from the anniversary of his loss at Pocono in 2015, there was IndyCar's medical coverage, which was used, and insurance and such, which helped after his loss. and I believe personal policy as well. So getting back to the primary question at hand here, Gary, as Mr. Gorsline said, in some cases drivers carry their own. Sometimes they rely on a series like IndyCar, which has some basic coverage to offer, and it is more of a personal preference item than, say, one standard that all conform to. Next question, Lee, bit of fun. We get to talk about a dirty Kiwi, although he was born in Australia. This comes in from Adam Smith. It says, Marshall, was the talk of uncertainty for Ganassi if Dixon left a serious concern, or was it a bluff? And then he has another question to follow up about Rosenqvist. I can tell you for sure, Adam, there was no bluffing involved. I would say that the knowledge we believe we have of Dixie's contract being a 1-year contract with a driver option for a second, think about that for a sec. If this is something where a driver wanted to make a long-term commitment in the eve of their career, we'd be talking about wanting a 3 or 4 or 5-year deal with really good money, and they could close out their career essentially. Nice security, nice everything. Someone was saying, hey, I'm coming back, but I still want to leave my options open. You might go for a 1 year with the driver option for a second, Lee. What comes to mind on that topic?
Well, what a great topic that is. From everything that I know, it wasn't as smooth as it was reported as to be. And Scott definitely was looking at options, and his manager, Stefan Johansson. And you got to remember too that Scott being a Kiwi, and that the allure of driving for McLaren, forget the history of McLaren as a race team and the success that they've had. Just the fact that it's the heritage of Bruce McLaren, a native New Zealander, has a big appeal there for Scott. And to me, I think it's I don't want to say nice because I hate that word, but it's appropriate that Scott has re-signed with Ganassi because Chip has done so much for him. It's been a very good home for him, and it would be very strange to be talking about Scott Dixon in a different team. But with that being said, it is a 1-year contract with a 1-year option. People have been talking about that it's multi-year, but to me, that leaves the door open because for future opportunities for Scott to then down the road end his career. You got to keep in mind, Scott's only 37 at the moment. Elio drove past his 40th. Juan Pablo Montoya drove past his 40th. And I'm talking recent years. We're not going to even mention Mario Andretti. But right now, Tony Kanaan is beyond 40. Scott's got at least another 5 years left in him, in my estimation, in my belief, because he's a phenomenal athlete. We don't even have to get into his driving capabilities. So, say if he does 2 more years for Ganassi, he's 39. He'll still be driving every bit as good as he is now. And then maybe he does 1 year for McLaren if McLaren has established themselves in IndyCar then with the Andretti Alliance or whatever it's going to be, whatever it looks like. But then it wouldn't surprise me if McLaren can get its ducks in a row in Formula One, get back to somewhat what they should be looking like or what they were. It would not surprise me, given Zach Brown's love of motorsport holistically and because of the heritage of McLaren, it would not surprise me for McLaren to have a Formula One team, an IndyCar team, a sports car team. And then, obviously Scott has been to Le Mans with the Ganassi and Ford GT program. Imagine if Scott could end his career with McLaren. And, he's then, what's he going to be then? A 5 or a 6-time IndyCar champion? Who knows? Is he going to win another 500? Who knows? And then ends his career driving for McLaren. I think it would be a fabulous story.
And I think, Adam, without casting any knowledge of whether this will or will not happen, if we learn at the end of the 2019 season that Scott Dixon is going to McLaren, I will not be shocked or surprised at all. And that's just based on not a lack of love for driving for Chip Ganassi or anything else, but serving exactly to what Lee mentioned, knowing the passion for Bruce McLaren and the McLaren team, his countrymen that Dixie happens to have. This is one of those genuine, once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. Timing wasn't right for 2019, but I think this contract that they came up with speaks to he's going to keep his eye on what does or does not happen over the span of the next year. And if there is something that makes him feel like the timing is right, he could be living his dream representing the team that his fellow New Zealander, Bruce McLaren, created. Let's move to your next question, Adam. And again, as we are winding down here on the Week in IndyCar on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires and supported by PNC Bank. Hey, we're talking about PNC Bank. Scott Dixon, I hear, represents them ably.
How appropriate. How appropriate.
Adam says, how real is the chance that Rosenqvist, that being Felix Rosenqvist, gets a ride with Ganassi next year? Having him and Alonso would be an enormous boost for IndyCar. Well, Adam, our friend Robin Miller put up a story on Saturday, having spoken with Roger Penske, and Roger confirmed what he told me back in June, that he was keeping both Simon Pagenaud and his new Indy 500 winner, so there are no seats open at the house of Roger. He also wrote that Felix was highly likely expected, or something along those lines, to land in the number 10 Chip Ganassi Racing Honda. I'll just say this, Adam. Robin has had, I think, 3 to 4 people who know. Tell him, it's not happening, it's done. It's a done deal. I have had 3, I think 3, I don't know if it's up to 4 yet, but I've had 3 people, whether it is in the U.S., even some in Europe, who are telling me, oh, no, I know for a fact, and here's how I know, it's a done deal. So if somehow it isn't a done deal, that would be the shock. So for everything that I know, even though it's being presented right now as a bit of a fuzzy topic, if Felix is not driving the number 10 next year, something weird will have happened. I rang Chip Ganassi on, I forget, mate, Thursday? Said, hey, we spoke on Monday during the Dixie announcement, and so now we know who's driving the number 9 car. Where are you at with sorting out the number 10? And we spoke about that on Monday. Gave me some insights on things that weren't necessarily the most glowing and supportive things, Lee, about the car's current occupant. Having gotten enough points of confirmation between myself and Robin to ring Chip back on whatever it was, Thursday, I think, say, hey, I keep hearing it's a done deal. Can you at least give me a good lie that I can use as a quote? And he said, quote, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so that's part of the dance, and I'm not belittling Chip by any means. Chip is not one to say yes or no when you ask him a yes or no question if he's not prepared to say that. So,
sorry, go on, mate.
No, I was just going to say, back to your question, Adam. If we aren't looking at the dream combination we've been hoping to see of Dixie and Felix together next year, that would be a shocker if that isn't what we have.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you, and you know, I've got it on, like you, on very good authority that unfortunately for Ed Jones, he won't be in that ride next year. And I kind of feel for Ed. He's a good kid. He's funny. He's got a very dry sense of humour. He's had a couple of podiums this year. I do think that a major turning point on the season was Phoenix, when he was headed for a second place and walled the thing all by himself. And I really do think that may have been a turning point, because has he been disastrous? No. Has he been great? No. He's just kind of been there. And you can't be at Ganassi and you can't be Scott Dixon's teammate if you're just there. You've got to be doing something. And I feel for him, because he's a good guy and he's a good driver, and hopefully he lands somewhere else. I'm not sure where that's going to be, but Yeah, it's a tough one. And if Rosenqvist is the man, which is the hot ticket, everybody's saying he's a super little driver.
I love that kid. He's funny too.
Yeah, funny, and he'll add a lot to the series. And again, I say this with every interview that I do, is that there is, and this is coming from a kid who grew up in Australia, in love with IndyCar, and loving the American greats of IndyCar in addition to the internationals right now, because IndyCar or kart or Aero, whichever genre, whichever era I should say that you want to talk about, was always criticised. Oh, there's too many Brazilians. Oh, there's too many Brits. Oh, there's too many Aussies. Oh, there's too whatever. IndyCar has a global appeal, and it is ostensibly an American sport, but it does have a global appeal and an international driver lineup. But there is such a healthy crop of American drivers right now who are succeeding, like Alexander Rossi, like Joseph Newgarden, like Ryan Hunter-Reay. Go on. But then you have this international flair, whether it be Scott Dixon or Will Power, and if Felix Rosenqvist comes along, or whomever you want to talk about, the Brazilians, all the Canadians. You've got Team Brazil at ABC Supply AJ Foyt Racing. You've got Team Canada at Schmidt Peterson Motorsports. There's plenty of international flair, but what really pleases me is this core of great American talent. So if Rosenqvist comes along, he'll add to that international flair, and he'll give us a lot to talk about.
And I don't know if folks are going to love this or hate this, but I actually like it in terms of the dynamic of our show here. We're, Lee, hour and 15 minutes in. You just mentioned Alexander Rossi, who won the dang race last weekend for the first time, and that's no disrespect to Alex. It was yet another drive for the ages by the guy, and only in 2.5 years into an IndyCar career. I actually have a kind of a, I don't want to say a opinion piece, but more of a what Racer calls an insight and analysis piece coming up, hopefully Wednesday or Thursday on Rossi, because I'm seeing some things in him that remind me a lot of Dixon. So admittedly, I wasn't planning on getting too heavy into Rossi or much at all here, because I'm going to be writing about it for Racer. But yeah, I'll just say in 10 seconds about Alexander Rossi. Good Lord, this guy has gone from, we know he's good but don't know how good, to I don't think even he knows how good he can become. I think the heights and the peaks for this kid, I think there's still a lot more to get, which is truly scary. Let's wrap with one or two more questions, Lee. Shay Small, I believe, is someone who we have finally figured out. I believe I incorrectly referred to Shay as a woman. Apologize, Shay. Clearly you are a man. Great apologies there. He said, "Hi, Marshall and Lee. A question that is not involving the big incident." He said, "I've noticed recently that IndyCar and Honda have been inviting YouTube vloggers, video bloggers, and, quote, influencers," and it pains me to say that through my teeth, has been inviting YouTube vloggers and influencers to come ride in the Honda two-seater. Do you think this is a clever marketing ploy to get younger people involved and consider IndyCar as something they should go see? I have an opinion, Lee, but you're my guest. What do you think?
I'm open to anything, whatever works to get the message out there. Yep, I don't care. I've never even been for a ride in the two-seater. No one's ever offered me a ride.
Well, funnily enough, Mark Miles offered me a ride at Laguna IndyCar date announcement, and I said, thanks, Mark, I love you, but I don't know if you've seen the opening of the cockpit and me, but I don't, that is a round peg in a square hole. Good Lord. That ain't going to match. That ain't going to work. So I'm going to wrap up here quickly. Lee, we've had a lot of folks compliment you directly on your handling of the crash on Sunday and having to vamp and having to fill 2 hours. Also, a lot of folks just complimenting the entire booth and NBCSN as a whole, and I wholly support all of that as well. Have had some folks asking a variety of questions about, has there been enough of an investigation into Ryan Hunter-Reay's spotter, and what was the interaction like there? Did he arm Hunter-Reay with enough information? And there have been questions about Michael Andretti and his comments, which fell on many deaf ears, assigning blame right after the crash. Granted, he was the setup to the question wasn't necessarily, was one that might have led to that reaction, but there are some other things that we could go into in more in depth. Maybe this is a cop-out, I don't know, but I kind of like the somewhat stripped-down aspect of what we've covered, because some of the other things, was Michael being a jerk or not? Does it matter? Did it change anything, positive or negatively? Is his life going to be altered based on whether we say he was a good person or bad person for how he responded? I don't find value in that. Ryan Hunter-Reay, the incident between he and Wickens, who might have been at fault, should someone have done something different, said something different over the radio. Again, I think there are learning points there, but I am not so interested in diving into and dissecting that, because I think at this stage, knowing Wiki is in the hospital recovering from spinal column surgery, this, I think, some of the bigger issues at hand make me less interested in scouring through some of the others. If this were a normal event and everyone went home okay, we probably would be delving into some of them, but I'm going to take a pass on most, so I hope those of you who sent in some of those questions, their questions are perfect and perfectly fine, it's just my appetite right now is not one where I want to delve into too much of those items.
Exactly.
So,
I mean, hey, listen, if there's a learning experience, or the just what transpired helps everybody learn. And while we're still on the line, I know we're wrapping up now, but I would like to say thank you to the people who have written into you, and to say thank you to me and to the booth, because that does mean a lot to us, because it's a very difficult situation. And I still think of myself as pretty young, but I'm becoming an old fart, I guess. I've been in TV for 22, almost 23 years now.
72 years old, Leigh Diffey, and going strong.
But, unfortunately, we get better at handling those, and me personally, I get better at handling those situations, unfortunately, because I've dealt with more and more of them over the years. And whether it be Justin Wilson or Jules Bianchi, or the legendary World Superbike racer Carl Fogarty, I was commentating live his final race and his final crash into the wall, and the list goes on. Alex Zanardi and Mike Rockenfeller, when his car was cut in half at Le Mans, he was over the other side of the wall in the darkness, and we didn't know where he was. And it just, unfortunately, time on task, and the years and the hours at doing this, and it teaches you to know what to say and how to handle it. But at the end of the day, we're human too. We're not just figures on TV, and it affects us. And a lot of these people we're talking about, like as you are, we're all friends with them, or we know them, or we've met their wives, or we've had dinner with them, and we've met their kids, and they're more than just athletes and drivers. They're human beings with families, and it makes you think about the whole picture in the moment, and for Robert, he's got his fiance, and he's got his whole life ahead of him. He's been a celebrated DTM driver, and he's just rocked the IndyCar world this year, and all of those factors, come into our minds when we're talking about this situation that's not a good one. And so I just wanted to say thank you to all the people for taking the time to write those nice things. But it's not about us; it's about Robert, and we're just, everybody's knocking on wood and crossing fingers that there's some positive news to come out of Lehigh Valley Hospital, that's for sure.
And speaking of something positive, I don't know if it's just Australianness in the air, but as you were just finishing your last sentence, I got a little notification on Twitter that a direct message had landed from one Craig Lowndes. So how do you like that? I got two awesome Aussies in my midst here, one by electronic communication, one over the phone. So brilliant there. I won't share what's in it, but thankfully he sent me the right photos, not the inappropriate photos, that, like you said. Just kidding there. Well, let's cover off on one or two here that are just one little bit informational and hopefully one that is genuinely fun to close, mate. So Kevin Kerner said, "Hi, Marshall. Could you explain to an engineering dummy like me the concept of slip angle? I've never been able to understand it." I will do my best, Kevin, and not saying you are an engineering dummy. I will just try and explain this in a way that isn't too engineering. If we're talking about slip angle, in the most general sense, we're talking about, I guess if we think more of the effects of it than getting into the science behind it. If we're talking about slip angle, it's basically how much a car can get sideways and recover. And so that could be, it's primarily a matter of tires, but also aerodynamics. So if we think about the previous Aero kit, Lee, which had a zillion pounds of downforce and all those kinds of things, it was also something that as a driver would get just a little bit sideways, the car would snap and spin. Because whether it's the combination of tire design, compound, and the way the car makes aerodynamic downforce pointed in a straight line versus when it starts to get a little bit sideways, you have downforce come off of the car very quickly. Basically, I'm not saying it's completely like turning off a faucet, but you go from having a lot of downforce to a lot less downforce. And in those conditions, previous Aero kit, drivers were very, very protective about driving a car that was super oversteery, because the combination of tire and the way downforce was made with the Chevy and Honda Aero kits, cars didn't have much slip angle to be able to use without the car rotating. The new Aero kit, with how it makes downforce, is far friendlier in that capacity. Drivers can get sideways, and with how IndyCar and Dallara have designed the downforce to be made, the cars do not shed nearly as much. So this is not really an engineering answer, Kevin. It's just more of, when people talk about slip angle, there's a limit of how wide the back of the car is going to get, one that you can control with your steering wheel in a slide, in a drift, if you want to call it that. In the old days, we would see nothing but drifting and a super friendly high slip angle. Often with today's car, we don't see that nearly as much. We can say that with the 2018 Universal Aero kit, there's definitely more slip angle available. And you, Lee, have seen it used on ovals and road courses and street courses like never before, which has been pretty darn awesome. Let's go to the last question from Daniel Ferris, who we mentioned at the Open for winning last week's Question of the Week, presented by TorontoMotorsports.com. He said, "Lee, who wins in a WWE cage match between Paul Tracy and Townsend Bell, and who would you choose to announce or call the bout from the current lineup of IndyCar drivers?"
That is a good question.
That is a great question.
I think so. Here are the attributes. Here are the physical attributes. If Paul got hold of Townsend, the poor old pretty boy from Santa Monica, from Malibu, wouldn't have a chance. But Townsend's fast and he's agile, so Paul would have to catch him first. And I think I've answered the question that if PT did get hold of the little fella, he wouldn't have a chance. And I think to commentate it, I think probably Hinch. I think Hinch would be funny calling it. He's done commentary before anyway, so yeah, I think that. I think, I think Townsend would just keep trying to run away from Paul, but if Paul got hold of him, it'd be all over. And then Hinch would make for an entertaining broadcast.
Just think about that big block head that PT has. I mean, there's no way you're beating that thing down. No, I mean, I can't think of anything Townie would be able to do to him in a WWE construct where he ends up winning, other than maybe taking him out of the knees and putting him in a sleeper hold.
Listen, let me tell you, he grabs hold of me all the time. PT, this is. He grabs hold of me all the time, and he's like, "What are you doing? What's going on? What's going on?" When he grabs hold of you, you know that you've been grabbed. Like, his hands are like bear paws. So the Malibu kid wouldn't stand a chance.
Part of me thinks Newgarden would also be a really fun commentator, because that kid has a lot of energy and gets hyped very easily, and would probably want to jump in and see if he could take the two of them out. So he might be the in-ring commentator as well.
That would be a good call. That would be a real good call.
I'm also thinking Pagano, possibly, just because it'd be hilarious to listen to.
It would.
Especially if you put on his Ricky Bobby affect. All right, Mr. Diffey, thank you, brother. Thank you for taking some time here on a personal vacation as well. So I knew you were going to be the right guy to help walk through a lot of these, some of these rather sensitive topics. And as always, mate, great job last weekend. Thank you so much for being a ready and willing contributor to help bring this little podcast to bear.
Well, the sport we love so much has such a loyal and passionate fan base that it's a pleasure to talk to you and to them as well. And I should say thank you to my bosses at NBC, because this is a race week. You know, it's Gateway in St. Louis, and they're letting me take it off because my best mate Tyron is getting married this weekend here in San Francisco. We've been friends for 30 years. We met at the first day of university back in Brisbane, Australia, and he's getting married here at the Olympic Club in San Francisco. So, and yours truly is the best man. So I've got to spend the next few days trying to think of a decent speech.
Wow. Well, he is crazy. So we're going to check in and make sure you are okay. But that's the norm. Thanks again, brother.
Thank you.